Johnny Carson's top 10 regrets have been made public. The American people were welcomed inside Johnny Carson's living rooms for 30 years. For millions of people, he is like family because to his warm personality and easygoing interviewing manner. He created a seamless public presence as host of The Tonight Show, making viewers feel as though they knew him well. But underneath Carson's endearing persona and world-famous golf swing were profound regrets that he carried with him to his grave. Someone who worked closely with Johnny Carson for more than 10 years said that Johnny was the most secretive superstar who ever lived. The audience only viewed the top layer. Someone he had painstakingly crafted to shield himself from the failures and disappointments that followed him around till the very end. Here are Johnny Carson's 10 greatest regrets, which he never admitted to the public, that we're exposing today. The true guy behind the TV icon was fashioned by his own personal tragedies and professional blunders. This is not a case of unfounded gossip, but rather verified statements from people very close to him. People who were there when Carson wished he could change things, including producers, authors, relatives, and confidants. But before we get into it, let's figure out why Carson's deepest regret struck him so hard, and why the TV legend who brought millions of people joy spent his last years increasingly alone, unable to make peace with his public triumphs and his private tragedies. By my upcoming guest, Joan Rivers, who, in my opinion, will not appear as stunning in person as she does in the promotional photos. Hello, would Miss Joan Rivers be welcome here? A person who froze Joan Rivers. Until she earned her own Fox show, she was his regular guest host for a long time. Carson remained silent thereafter. He is sorry. Several people close to Carson later said that he felt remorse for his emotionless response, particularly in the aftermath of Joan's husband's suicide. He flat out refused to answer her calls. It had become personal. It began on a personal level and persisted through every stage. When Carson took one of his many trips, Joan Rivers was there to fill in without a hitch for years. Carson seemed genuinely thrilled by Rivers' razor-sharp wit, and their on-air chemistry captivated listeners. Carson frequently mentored Rivers on the subtleties of hosting, suggesting that their connection behind the scenes was just as cordial. In 1986, Rivers took a job hosting The Late Show on the nascent Fox network without informing Carson beforehand, which Carson perceived as a betrayal. It was Fox's news release, not Joan herself, that Johnny heard about Joan's show, according to Fred de Cordova, Carson's veteran producer. To me, that was the height of treachery. Quick and decisive was Carson's reply. Without hesitation, Johnny rejected Rivers' repeated efforts at reconciliation and promptly booted her off The Tonight Show. Carson showed no emotion whatsoever following the 1987 suicide of Rivers' husband, Edgar Rosenberg, a tragedy that would have rendered most people more empathetic. According to an ex-NBC page who now works for Rivers, Joan called Johnny following Edgar's death in the hopes that he would at least offer sympathies. The call would go unanswered by him. Even after Carson retired, she continued to attempt to make amends. Rivers later spoke frankly about the breakup, saying she regretted her handling of the situation and that Carson's reaction was exaggerated. His complete silence on Edgar's passing wounded me. Rivers reportedly told interviewers that wasn't about business anymore. Several Carson insiders claimed that in Carson's latter years, he privately regretted the extremeness of his reaction, admitting that the professional affront was true, but that his response had been needlessly harsh. But at that point, making amends was out of the question. After 9 years without Carson's presence on the show, Rivers was finally welcomed back by Jimmy Fallon in 2014. Something must be kept in mind, Eileen. The square is known as kidding. For Johnny, the grief of a divorce is immense. He's a man who feels things deeply. As for number 2, he wed Joanna Holland without first establishing a prenuptial agreement. On their anniversary, Johnny presented her with marriage licenses as a surprise. 3 years down the road, she caught him off guard with the divorce paperwork and more than $20 million in her pocket. Ed McMahon was informed in private by his regret that he should have never tied the knot without a lawyer present. Carson's third marriage was a perfect example of the rash love choices that had a devastating effect on his mental and financial health. During what she believed to be an anniversary party on September 30th, 1972, he shocked Holland, a model he had been seeing for a number of years, by presenting her with marriage papers. It was classic Johnny, simultaneously romantic and reckless, recounted Henry Bushkin, Carson's memoirist and attorney. He decided to get married and did it, without consulting anyone or having his lawyers create a prenuptial agreement. The marriage lasted for 9 years until Holland filed for divorce in 1983. It was one of the priciest settlements in Hollywood history. Almost $20 million in liquid assets, including the bare residence and an investment portfolio. Carson felt the financial hit more acutely because it happened so often. Following their divorce in 1972, his second wife, Joan Copeland, had likewise gotten a sizable sum. Carson apparently had deep resentment for his ex-wives because, by the time his third marriage came to an end, he had given them about $30 million. A journalist who worked closely with Johnny Carson during his time as a Tonight Show contributor remarked that Johnny became considerably more cynical about relationships after his divorce from Holland. In the course of his speech, he would improvise scathing jokes concerning marriage. It was clear that their fury was real. After the divorce was settled, Ed McMahon recalled a chat he had with Carson. "Johnny warned me, Ed, never marry anyone without a lawyer in the room. Love fades, but alimony is forever." Carson's disdainful outlook would shape his 1987 fourth and final marriage to Alexis Moss, which was preceded by a comprehensive prenuptial agreement and continued until his passing. Lastly, he ended up estranging his son. Rick Carson, the youngest son of Rick Carson, had a difficult childhood. He battled mental illness, was convicted of repeated DUIs, and was involuntarily confined once. Carson observed the distance. He is sorry. It was in 1991 when Rick was killed in a vehicle accident. Carson was private about it, but those close to him say he was distraught and wished he had done more as a parent afterward. The public image of Johnny Carson as America's charming host stood in stark contrast to his repute as a cold and frequently absent father to his 3 sons from his previous marriage to Jody Walcott. His relationship with his youngest son, Rick, was the most problematic and sad of all these difficult relationships. Several mental health diagnoses, including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, plagued Rick Carson throughout his adult life. In the 1980s, his problems were evident in his increasingly irrational behavior, numerous DUI arrests, and one involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. A close member of the family who knew both men claimed that Johnny was totally unprepared to deal with Rick's issues. Because he was raised in the Midwestern Stoic culture, which frowns upon showing emotion and even more frowns upon acknowledging mental illness, he chose to isolate himself. A painful cycle was created by this emotional distancing. Carson distanced himself, unable to deal with issues he didn't comprehend or have any say over, while Rick's actions become increasingly worrisome. Those familiar with the family say that Carson usually responded to Rick's problems by sending money instead of providing emotional assistance. An old acquaintance of Johnny's claimed that if there was an issue inside the family, Johnny would simply write a check. He lacked heartlessness. Mental illness is difficult, and he lacked the emotional resources to cope. Therefore, he withdrew to his job and allowed his lawyer deal with the nuts and bolts. On June 21, 1991, the sad climax occurred when Rick Carson's vehicle crashed down an embankment close to Morro Bay, California, killing him. At the age of 39, he retired. Johnny Carson thanked viewers for their condolences and briefly mentioned the death on The Tonight Show before swiftly getting back to the show's usual structure. But Carson was reportedly saddened, tormented by what might have been different if he had been more involved in his son's childhood, according to acquaintances who spoke to him privately. According to a close friend, Johnny would occasionally bring up Rick after he had a few beers following his death. In his speeches, he would occasionally mention, "I should have done more," or "I didn't know how to help him." It was one of the few times I ever saw Johnny express genuine regret. Tonight, Richard Pryor will be present. Seriously, he's completely disregarding Richard Pryor. There has never been a better comedian than Pryor, but Carson seldom used him. The rationale behind it? Far too erratic. Directors of NBC expressed their apologies. Johnny came clean about Pryor being among the best we've ever had later on. Even Carson himself recognized he messed up, according to insiders. Richard Pryor's unfiltered, blood-soaked explorations of gender, power, and racism shook up American comedy in the 1970s. The critics thought he was brilliant. Even his other comics took note of his method, and his concert videos were a financial success. However, Pryor's absence from the most important stage for stand-up comedians, The Tonight Show, during this time of creative brilliance was noticeable. According to an on-air talent coordinator from that time, Carson's discomfort with Pryor's material was well known in the comedy industry. As a performer and the head of a major network show, Johnny respected Pryor's technical abilities in timing, delivery, and structure, but he was uneasy about Pryor's raw, vulgar manner. There were a number of uncomfortable and inconsistent outcomes from Pryor's appearances on The Tonight Show. He had to do a lot of tweaking to get his content to pass network censors. Producers were concerned about possible tantrums, and Carson himself didn't appear to be able to connect with the kind of conventional comedians he usually did. A writer who was associated with both guys made the observation that Johnny enjoyed having command of his program, while Pryor was inherently unpredictable. It has nothing to do with race or anything else personal. Pryor thrived on shocking audiences with unsettling realities, while Johnny just did not want shocks. Carson allegedly started to rethink his strategy as Pryor's health deteriorated in the 1980s and his cultural influence became indisputable. He admitted to staff members and at least one interviewee in the industry that Pryor was one of the greatest we've ever had and regretted not showcasing him more during his peak years. Richard should have been featured more frequently. A producer who worked on Carson's latter seasons remembers Johnny saying to them about 1990, "That was a mistake." For Johnny Carson, who so rarely admitted being wrong, those words carried heavy meaning. Unfortunately, by the time he realized it, Richard Pryor's multiple sclerosis had progressed to the point where his stage presence was limited. The opportunity to showcase one of comedy's greatest talents in his prime had slipped away. Carson would later confess it was a professional regret that stayed with him. "I wish you luck, John. It's time for me to move on," Carson once said, quickly clarifying, "I'm not retiring. I'm simply stepping away from hosting this show." Losing his connection with Don Rickles was another regret. Rickles had been a favorite on The Tonight Show, but their bond cooled after a joke went too far. While they occasionally worked together afterward, Carson never fully forgave him, and he regretted allowing that friendship to fade. Their on-air chemistry was undeniable. Rickles' sharp humor and Carson's calm reactions produced unforgettable moments. But during a 1970s taping, Rickles made an unscripted crack about Carson's divorce and alimony. It was the kind of personal issue Carson wanted to keep off limits. Though he laughed for the cameras, behind the scenes Carson was deeply upset. He didn't shout. That wasn't his way, a writer remembered. But he went cold, and Rickles instantly knew he had crossed the line. Afterward, Rickles appeared less often, and their effortless banter was never quite the same. Years later, when Carson invited him to dinner, the old spark was gone. After Carson's death, Rickles admitted, "Johnny was the best, but once you landed in his doghouse, it was nearly impossible to climb back out. And I stayed there for years." When Carson finally walked away from The Tonight Show in 1992, he avoided most interviews, tributes, and retrospectives. Privately, he confessed that his farewell felt incomplete. Over 50 million tuned in for his final broadcast, where he told viewers, "It has been an honor and a privilege to come into your homes." Yet after that heartfelt goodbye, Carson vanished almost entirely from the public eye. Johnny thought leaving clean was the best approach, longtime producer Peter LaSalle explained. But I think he underestimated how abrupt it would feel, for the audience and for himself. Months later, Carson admitted, "I should have done more to properly thank everyone." That lack of closure haunted him throughout retirement. His relationship with NBC was another sore spot. Despite 3 decades of loyalty, Carson often felt the network didn't fully support him. They owned The Tonight Show and even considered replacing him multiple times. Unlike modern hosts, Carson wasn't the owner of his program until 1981, when he created Carson Productions. By then, he felt he had already lost control and millions in earnings. "You give a network your life, but they still keep a knife in your back pocket." He once remarked that NBC's disloyalty left him wary. Though he favored David Letterman as his successor, he stayed silent while the network pushed Jay Leno, something he came to regret. In later years, Carson admitted he should have taken independence much earlier. His clash with Chevy Chase also lingered. When Chase appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 70s, the exchange was stiff and combative. Chase came across arrogant and unprepared, and the final straw was a divorce joke aimed at Carson. Carson quietly banned him, insisting Chase would never return. Yet in later years, he admitted he might have overreacted. "Chevy was difficult," Carson reportedly said, "but maybe I should have given him another chance." Another regret was shutting out women in comedy. During the 1970s and 80s, very few female comedians were booked. Carson believed the audience wasn't ready, and many rising stars never got their shot. This meant performers like Sandra Bernhard and Paula Poundstone were largely overlooked. A former staffer admitted, "We had an unofficial quota, maybe one female comic a month, and Johnny almost always passed after watching their tapes." Years later, Carson conceded, "We missed a lot of good ones. I was wrong about what the audience wanted." Watching those same comedians thrive elsewhere drove the lesson home, but too late to change his record.in retirement. Carson lived almost entirely in seclusion. He avoided parties, reunions, and honors. His Malibu estate became both his sanctuary and his cage that a close friend explained. "Johnny built this perfect bubble, but eventually discovered it was a prison." By the time he realized, he had forgotten how to connect with people. Even when inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame, he declined to attend. Tributes were arranged in his honor, but he refused them all. Years later, he admitted in a private letter, "I made millions laugh, but most nights I sat alone." His deepest regret wasn't tied to ratings or fame. It was personal. In building walls for privacy, he ended up isolating himself. Johnny Carson's regrets show the man behind the curtain, brilliant, private, proud, and sometimes lonely. Despite his unmatched success, his missed opportunities left lasting shadows. "I miss the applause," he once confessed. "I miss the confirmation, but I don't miss the burden." In the end, his story is both triumphant and bittersweet, a reminder that even legends who seem to have everything still look back and wonder what could have been.